Howdy. So I'm gonna try this time just not using my headset with the microphone on it. Just I don't know. I mean, maybe let me know anybody in a comment or something, because I feel like sometimes when I don't use that microphone thing, then it's my voice sometimes is too quiet. People, you have to turn it up too loud, but then when I use it, it's too loud. So I don't know. I'm gonna try to not use it and just speak loudly. Um, Anyway, I'm just watching the Jimmy Dore show. The Gray Zone. What's his name? Blumenthal, Mount Blumenthal. He was sued by some heiress who just Zionists trying to attack the Gray Zone and bring it down and try to start some war between Iran and Israel. Um, but I mean, I don't know. It's just we have to realize like the type of evil we're against. It's not like we're playing a basketball game and the other team is like really good or even kind of plays a little dirty. It's like, no, we're not even playing. Like if they start losing, they'll just change it to football. They'll change it to, like there's I mean, I think a lot of people realize how evil like the powers that be are, and that's why so many people who have no principles are as cucked as they are because they're smart. And I mean, maybe they're not smart because they don't see the revolution coming, but they're smart in this world, in this kind of empire that we're in the sense that they know that the best way to that good people get attacked. So let's be scum. They're all like, we know, like, we see all these good people getting attacked and destroyed and their lives and careers ruined. So we'll just be scum and pretend that that's just our real personality. But I mean, I'm sure a lot of those people who claim that they trust the government and trust Biden and whatever, they don't. They're just like they're it's not about principle. They just understand that those are the Nazis with the most power right now. And so that's how those people are. They just cozy up to whichever Nazis are the most powerful at any moment. Um, I think like there's just so much fucking like absurd assumptions as if like our task is so easy, like we just have to win elections or we just have to put some pressure on Congress. Like I need to explain like history, like the people, like the property owners, the ruling class and the owning class, which is the same class basically. They got there mostly by conquest and killing people, like the ruling class of England got there by William the Conqueror showing up and, killing anybody that opposed him taking over and owning England and Britain, whatever, just as, maybe the Anglo-Saxons had done before them. And that's still the basis of all this. The basis is violence. Like this song and dance about democracy is just a cover story. um I mean, it's a great idea, democracy. It's a fabulous idea and we should do it someday, absolutely. But we have not done it yet. I mean, if we have done it, um we've done it within very very narrow parameters. Like I would say like Jefferson. Yeah, like Jefferson. There's certain times where certain presidents you could say, yeah, they were the choice of the people. Like Jefferson was better than Adams because Jefferson was, a slave owner, racist, etc. But Adams was just like full on evil, hated everybody that didn't have 100,000 acres. Literally, like he despised everybody that wasn't rich, just as rich people still do. You know, rich people generally throughout history and today, they despise poor people. They think we're scum, you know, and which they have to do if they want to claim that they deserve what, you know, their largesse and this inequality has some kind of basis in justice, meritocracy. They have to pretend that we're all trash and we're all evil and that they're great. So, um, anyway, I was just thinking about uh history. I was thinking about American history, the US history, and you know, like how did we get any rights? By shooting people. So you can cry more if you're a hippie, you can cry more if you're some kind of like spiritual whatever the fuck, but the right that you have to cry, the right that you have to do what you want happened because leftists killed some, you know, right wingers. Leftists killed some loyalists, royalists, you know, we killed some, yeah, we fought, we shot people. So if you want to live in your pacifist utopia, the utopia that only pacifism can create, then I don't know, go to some place where nobody's ever like rebelled. Go to Singapore where, you know, the government does all makes all your decisions for you. Um, I mean, like, even Singapore is not necessarily that bad. Like, they at least give people housing, which is better than the US. The US, the ruling class still makes all basically all the decisions for you, especially if you're poor. And they make even worse decisions. So, but I just want to, like, honestly, like, people who are so against, like, I don't want violence. I would much rather have a way that we can have justice without, um, like without armed conflict or something. I mean, I would love to see, I wouldn't mind seeing all the people who are, you know, the rulers of today guillotined and their, you know, heads cut off. I wouldn't mind that. But as far as actual armed conflict, that gets messier because then sometimes good people die too, and that's bad. So, and I'd rather nobody died than good people died. But again, I'd much prefer that the scum die, or at least like be removed from society in a permanent way. Um, so anyway, like I was just thinking about the American Revolution, and the American Revolution was made possible because like the Declaration of Independence was basically made possible because the Quakers, who were the conservative element in Pennsylvania, which was Pennsylvania was the most important state by far in early America. Like nowadays, Pennsylvania is like, unless you watch like Sunny in Philadelphia, like nobody even thinks of Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania was the New York of early America. Like New York only became New York really in like the 1800s. But in the 1700s, Philadelphia was the New York, was the metropolis of the United States, and and in that what was originally the colony of Pennsylvania, the ruling class, you know, was conservative, like the ruling class of all colonies, and they were the Quakers. And you know, some of my ancestors, I'm descended from both sides of that, like because Pennsylvania was divided between the Quakers and their kind of German sectarian kind of Shaker Mennonite allies who were very rich and very conservative politically generally, except on the issue of slavery. They were very based on, you know, they wanted to abolish slavery. They were like the only people, at least the only conservative, wealthy people that wanted to really abolish slavery in America. And and then the other major population in Pennsylvania was the Presbyterians, who were primarily Ulster Scottish, you know, Irish Presbyterians of Scottish ancestry. Um, and a lot of them were also anti-slavery, based on Presbyterianism and just their principles, their politics as well, since they were Presbyterians were the founders of liberalism in the UK. So, but the Presbyterians were much poorer on average. They tended to live in Appalachia. They still live in, we still live in Appalachia. We are the kind of preeminent Appalachian population. I think we largely, the, the Appalachian dialect largely is our dialect, the Ulster Scots dialect. Um, but yeah, so there was that conflict, and of course the Quakers took the Tory side because the Quakers were filthy rich. They were doing fine under British rule. They had no problem under British rule, even though it was the British rule that was preserving slavery. But their commitment to the British was stronger than their anti-slavery convictions. So they tended to be Tories. But because they were pacifists, they were pretty worthless Tories, like they couldn't actually be effective. So um, they basically were pushed aside by the Ulster Scots, because the Ulster Scots said, the Presbyterians said, like, these Quakers, we're in wartime. They went to the Continental Congress. They said, we're in wartime, and these Quakers are pacifists, so they are not, they're not able to legislate in wartime, obviously. Like, they're against war in any circumstances, supposedly, especially when it goes against their economic interests. So they're not qualified to legislate at that time. So based on that, the Pennsylvania government was replaced, with the support of the Continental Congress, or at least parts of it, and a new constitution, a constitution was created to replace the Pennsylvania Charter of William Penn, and that constitution was, um, you could say, really the birth of the modern left started with that constitution. It was the basis for the French Revolution. It was the basis for uh, American radicalism. Um, it became the model for radicals for generations, and it expanded the French franchise. It let poor people vote for the first time, really. Um, and I think Pennsylvania already had like a lower franchise property qualification than Great Britain had, but this lowered it much more. It brought all taxpayers into the franchise, so that included I believe, the vast majority of men in Pennsylvania. So so that was very radical. It also didn't have a Senate, which a lot of the other colonies, they had like an upper assembly, just like the US government has a Senate where people like Schumer and Bernie and whatever get to like tell us that they know better than us, and the Senate is like the real, like, the elites. Like, that's what it's meant to be. It's the elites that control the country. It's supposed to be the landowners. It's based on the House of Lords. So it's a very right-wing concept, but and at that time there was no Senate in the federal government. There was, we had the Continental Congress under the, I don't know if it is the Articles of Confederation, that might have been later, but um, Congress was unicameral. It had one house. There was no superior house to like veto those acts of the people's representatives. Um, and so the Pennsylvania model was following that same model, and they tried to insert, like, the radicals tried to insert into the Pennsylvania Constitution that like a maximum wage, or at least in terms of, I think, landed property, like a limit on how much land somebody could own, because they said like once somebody owns enough property that they basically have power to like overthrow the rest of the state, then that becomes, like that should be they should be bought out just to preserve democracy. Um, so and or I don't know if it was even bought out or they just people should be prevented from ever monopolizing that much property. And unfortunately it failed of a majority, but the spirit of it, I mean, it was written partly with William Penn in mind and the Penn estates that took up much of Pennsylvania, which a lot of us like Ulster Scots Presbyterians were squatters on, and which was very irksome to his land agents, etc. But so it was in 1776. We they the Presbyterian Party, the Whig Party basically established a constitution, a Whig constitution, a liberal constitution, and gave the right to bear arms, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion. Pretty much everything in our Bill of Rights was in the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights of 1776. And it was all voted on in a pretty standard way, like the only uh difference was that the revolution was seen as illegal by the Tories and by a lot of the Quakers and German sectaries. So a lot of them, or probably some of them, didn't take part because they saw it as illegitimate. But other than that, it was fairly like standard process. But the elites, like even of the revolutionaries, um, the quote unquote, leading revolutionaries of Pennsylvania were against it because they were rich, the quote unquote leaders of, I mean, they were not the leaders of the revolution. They were, but, you know, the rich positioned themselves as the leaders of whatever they're involved in. So they had the money to position themselves that way and they had the prominence. And a lot of them were generals. A lot of the wealthy tend to be made generals, and then the poor, at least historically, were made as kind of foot soldiers. So a lot of the wealthy had been generals during the French and Indian War, prior to the Revolution, and um, so they were basically brought in as generals again for the American Revolution, and they still wanted to wield that kind of like elitism. And but when they saw this Constitution, they were like, "Oh hell no, we're not gonna support some revolution that like divests us of our privilege." So they they opposed it. They basically tried to prevent it going into practice, and um, so I don't have the exact quote handy, but I know that there was a letter from one of those men. I think it was one of the generals that was one of the French and Indian War generals, um, of Western Pennsylvania, who said that like all of us, like, wealthy people, but basically we opposed it, but the masses, like the plebes, um, and this is the part that I remember by heart, that he said they enforced it by fixed bayonets. So basically, they pointed guns at the rich people and they said, "Well, we voted on this, and I know you guys are not going to allow it to actually happen." Just like with Bernie or with anything, it doesn't matter how you vote, they're not going to let it happen unless you enforce it with fixed bayonets, like some of my ancestors were brave enough and smart enough to do. Um, I mean, you could say like maybe it backfired, it certainly didn't hold up for too long. Even that constitution was overthrown in like the 1790s and replaced with in many ways much shittier, more aristocratic constitution based on the bicameral corruption of our federal constitution. Um, but I'm just trying to like I know that like not everybody has to be a revolutionary. You don't have to be ready to like grab your musket and run to the some people they're just either for physical reasons or for whatever, they're not down. That's fine. But you have to acknowledge that somebody might have to do that for you to have any rights at all. And you have to have some respect for whoever does have the balls to do that. Um, or else you're, arguably like we're like people who crap on militants who are like, well, I'm a moderate. I agree with everything the militants want. I just don't like their militancy. I would like them to be more polite. I would like them to, have deference. I would like them to not use direct action. Like I find a lot of those like bad faith critics are worse, potentially worse than the actual like, oligarchs and people in power or whatever, because they help, they're the main uh like weapon. They're the psychological, manipulation. They're the tools that help manipulate the rest of us into like being as cucked as they are, or as cucked as they pretend to be, as servile as they are. um so anyway, I was just remembering that. And I know that there's a lot of people on the left that like, hate white people, hate men, hate the US. Okay. But if you don't have the bravery that those leftists had, 200 years ago in America, to push for socialism, to abolish slavery as they did in Pennsylvania. It's like the modern shit libs are like the Quakers who say, oh, we really want to abolish slavery. We think slavery is wrong and everything. We're the most anti-slavery. But the king says no, so what can you do? The king is king. And we will defend the king, and we will give money to the king's cause, and we will help spy and, give intelligence to help the king's cause. And unlike those terrible Presbyterians who, I mean, the ironic thing is the Presbyterians, the Quakers had freed all of their slaves, which great credit for that. They literally, they put their money where their mouth was. They freed all their slaves in like 1770 something or 1760 something. So that was good, but they were still protecting the system that maintained the slave trade, because America, American colonies had been trying to abolish the slave trade for a long time. And the royal veto prevented it. The king could veto any act of any colonial assembly, basically, or at least the royal colonies. And so he ensured that that could never happen. So the Quakers, even though they were so anti-slavery that they freed their own slaves, like, but at the same time they protected slavery because they opposed the revolution, which was the only way to actually end slavery. And once the Quakers got pushed aside and the Irish Presbyterians took charge, they actually did abolish slavery in Pennsylvania, and they also abolished it in Vermont. Um, you know, with no help really from the Quakers. And you know, and they did it with fixed bayonets. That's it. In a way, they were lucky. They were surrounded by the Presbyterian, the Ulster Presbyterians, Ulster Scots, Irish Presbyterians. They had their own elites who were against them. The majority of them were poor Appalachian people, but their elites, the rich among them, were against them. but the rich among them didn't have a good, other rich allies to join forces with, because the most of the money in the state, in the colony, was in the hands of the Quakers and the Mennonites and these wealthy German, other German sectaries that were allied with the Quakers religiously, politically, and economically. But they were all pacifists. So they couldn't do shit. So that was the luck. That's the only reason why the US exists, was because of the luck that the Quakers were pacifists. Like, I'm glad Quakers were anti-slavery, but they were still evil in the role they played in the revolution. They protected slavery. And if they had had their way, we would still have slavery, basically. I mean, chances are. So so it shows like those Quakers are kind of like a lot of the shit libs nowadays, that are like, at least on paper. I mean, the only difference is the shit libs nowadays would not have actually freed their own slaves. So I'd say the Quakers are like to the left of them, but but the kind of argument they made that, like, incrementalism, like, well, we're the real anti-slavery people, but the only way to really end slavery is incrementalism, voluntarism. Like, we need to just convince each person to free their slaves or something. Like, whereas the king, they could never ban it, because the king that they worshipped, that they loved and were loyal to, was gonna always veto it, because he made a lot of money off slavery and the slave trade. So it took the radicals, who were like, who, some of them weren't even anti-slavery. Most of them were. A lot of the Ulster Scots were. Some of them were not. But basically, the militants, they had to overthrow the British control, and then we could actually abolish slavery. I mean, obviously, you could of course argue that we still have forms of slavery, but at least that specific form of chattel slavery was abolished in Pennsylvania and Vermont, and very quickly afterwards, the rest of the northern states followed Pennsylvania's example and abolished slavery. So people who say that the revolution was like pro-slavery are like are like children. Like, they've never read anything about the revolution. Like, in 1770, there was slavery in every state in the Union, and in 1800 there was no slavery north of Mason-Dixon line, or if there was, it was being phased out. So yeah, sorry for the people who thought they could like kumbaya their way to like utopia, and that the only problem with the world is people having a backbone and standing up against evil. Like, there's a lot of these pacifists, they think pacifism is just like the panacea to everything, and they just think the only problem with the world is judgment, and the fact that some people actually call evil out and state facts, and that if we just like love and forgive and forget and ignore everything bad, then everything will be good. Like, anyway, so those are like those people, and luckily we kicked them out. And my Presbyterian ancestors kicked out my Quaker ancestors from government and proceeded to abolish slavery, actually, with fixed bayonets. And so I'm explaining, like, the US wouldn't exist. I mean, obviously the revolution itself was violent, but even within the revolution, the rights that we have would not exist without violence and without the threat of violence. And if that scares you, just fuck off from politics forever. Get out of our face. Get out of this. You're a child. You're a child. You're like those Quakers who are not. You should get out of the Pennsylvania Assembly, because this is our time of revolution, and you clearly are not capable, and you don't have enough morality to actually deal with you just have this belief in pacifism, and you don't care what like, obviously there's times when pacifism is good, and there's times when peace is great, but this type of lazy universal absolutist pacifism, and cowardly absolutist pacifism, is disgusting, and a lot of these shit libs still hide behind this type of stuff.